All right. In addition to the lease receivable, when you're dealing with a sales type lease, you have to deal with the sales components. So the easy part is the inventory. So you're going to have lease receivable, cost of goods sold, sales revenue, and inventory. So the inventory is just the cost of the item, so that's no big deal. The lease receivable is complicated, and we talked about it. It's present value of lease payments plus PV of any unguaranteed residual value. Residual value, got to read the hieroglyphics, and that's value if item returned. All right, so you're going to have to look at another lecture for the details there, but just reminding you if you remember. So really, the trick is calculating these two. Once you have your lease receivable, the inventory is not tricky. And on this table, I have the sales type lease scenarios. In particular, what messes people up is dealing with the residual value. So what I found helpful is to break it down into these three different scenarios. So we're going to calculate sales revenue. We're going to calculate cost of goods sold. And then we're going to notice what happens to gross profit, because that's kind of a topic of interest, is discussing the different gross profit between or among sales type lease scenarios. So scenario one, the residual value is guaranteed. That means if it's guaranteed, the item is returned to the lessor, because why would the lease agreement make the lessee guarantee the residual value if they kept it? That would make no sense, because the lessee would be guaranteeing it to themselves. So the only time you have a guarantee is when the item is returned, okay? But in this case, second case, residual value, not guaranteed, but it's still returned, okay? So I just wouldn't talk about the guarantee unless it's returned. And then the item is transferred. If an item is transferred, where's my pen? There's no residual value. Gosh, I just can't write that small on this thing. No residual value for lessor. They don't get it back. So the lessee gets it. The lessee gets the residual value. So if the item's transferred is worth $20,000, hey, the lessee gets it. And that's okay, because it was taken into consideration when the lease was originally negotiated, okay? But from an accounting perspective, we just have to understand who's getting what when. All right, and if the item's transferred, the lessor, even if it says the thing's worth $20,000, they're not getting any of it. So the lessor's effective residual value or actual residual value when the item is transferred is zero. Okay, so let's look across these scenarios and how it's measured. So when the residual value is guaranteed, it's included in the lease payments. So all you need to know is the lease receivable capitalized. So you already did that calculation, and essentially your debit to lease receivable capitalized will equal your credit to sales revenue. And that's because it includes the present value of the residual value. All right. Now, in the second scenario, when it's not guaranteed but it's returned, it's the present value of the lease payments, but that's the lease receivable capitalized minus the present value of the residual value. But you're saying, hey, Dr. Sierra, this makes no sense. It's the present value of lease payments in both cases. Well, let me put my little finger quote, and I can't do that because I'm writing air quotes. I'm air quoting. Lease payments we're talking about the GAAP definition of lease payments, right? So that's the rent payment, if you will, the monthly or annual payment for using the item, but it also includes any guaranteed residual value if there is one. In this case, there isn't one. So we have to subtract out the present value of the residual value, because when the item is returned, but the residual value is not guaranteed, the lease receivable equals the present value of lease payments plus the present value of the unguaranteed residual value. However, the sales revenue excludes it. Excludes the PV of the residual value. So, and why does it? The logic from the Financial Accounting Standards Board is, hey, that residual value is 5 years away, and you're giving it your best shot. You say it's going to be worth $20,000 in 5 years, but there's a lot of uncertainty there. It could be worth $100,000. It could be worth zero. Who knows, right? Or less risky cases, it could be worth 25 or 15, somewhere in there. You don't know. But the idea is that it's kind of random. Your expected residual value at the end may not be the one you realize, or your actual residual value, or your expected at the beginning may not be your actual, or what do you call it? Your realized residual value at the end. So anyway, so we take it out of, we can't count it as sales revenue. We can't recognize it, so that's why it does that. And finally, if the item is transferred, it's weird. The item is transferred, so they don't have a residual value, so it does exclude the residual value. But when the lessor included the idea that they weren't going to get a residual value, so they made it up in the payment. So the lease receivable capitalized doesn't include a residual value, okay? But, the residual value is zero. So, you can think of the present value of residual value being zero. If you subtracted it from both sides, it'd still be the same thing. All right? So in a sense, it's kind of weird. Number 1 case and number 3 case over here, item transferred and residual value guaranteed, have the same basic formula. Lease receivable capitalized equals the sales revenue. The difference between the two is that they don't actually present value the same thing. In number 1, you will include the present value of the residual value. In item 3, the lessor's residual value is zero because the lessee ends up getting it. Okay? Now, for cost of goods sold, notice that number 1 and number 3 just equal the cost of the item. In scenario number 2, it's really easy peasy lemon squeezy. You take the cost and you just subtract the present value of the residual value. Once again, if it's not guaranteed, there's too much risk to the lessor. So if you're not going to recognize the revenue, you don't match the cost of goods sold associated with it. You have to take out the present value of the residual value. So actually, scenario 2 ends up being not too bad, because if you can see, from lease receivable capitalized minus present value residual value, cost of item minus present value residual value, you calculate the present value of the residual value and just subtract it from your lease receivable capitalized for your sales revenue, so you reduce the credit by a fixed amount. And then you subtract it from the cost of the item to get your cost of goods sold, so you're subtracting the debit and the credit by a fixed amount. All right. Now, what we want to see in every case, the gross profit is going to be the same. It's going to be exactly the same. In scenario 2, okay, so let's say in scenario 1, you have 100 and cost of goods sold of 80, so you end up with 20. So over here, let's say you'd have 100, 80, and 200 for your gross profit. Well, over here, let's say that your present value of your residual value was 10, and you subtract it from both, right? So then you get 90 less 70, and voila. You're subtracting both sides by the same thing, so the distance, which is the gross profit as a difference, is the same. So the take-home message is, no matter what scenario you're in, the gross profit is always going to be equal, because it's measuring the difference. Okay? All right. So that's how you measure sales revenue and cost of goods sold for a sales type lease. And later we'll get into some, that's not what I meant to do. I didn't mean to stop sharing. I meant to stop recording. And we'll get into some actual numbers. So this is just obviously just conceptual. And I think when you put some numbers in, it'll all come together for you.